Welcome to the D&D Fitness Radio Podcast, brought to you by your hosts, Don Saladino from New York City and Derek Hansen from Vancouver, Canada.
Hey, Dr. Perlmutter, long time, buddy.
Good to see everybody. Oh my gosh.
It's been a while.
Terrific.
Can you see us?
I can.
Perfect. How you been? How's the family doing?
Everybody good. How about you? Where are you living?
Long Island now. I've been in Long Island for a couple of years now.
When was the last time I saw you? When I worked out with you at your place?
Probably. That might have been it. And obviously, you know, we've always had some interactions with GOL. But
I think maybe we ran into each other in Palm Beach or something.
Maybe. Yeah. I remember you and I both spoke on that. You were obviously the speaker everyone really wanted to hear. So it was just fun. It was fun to be there. But this is, Derek Hansen. I mean, we've been on this podcast before a long time ago, and it's great to have you back on.
Yeah. Derek, I remember you from a previous podcast, right?
Yeah. Are those real books behind you?
They are.
I have fake books behind me.
No, as a matter of fact, the one right here at head level, going from there I can't show you the other side. I wrote all those. Those are all ones I've written.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome.
So it's not just, I mean, we normally don't do an intro. We just go into it and then we do the intro later, but it's not just, it's not just Brainmaker and Grain Brain and now obviously Brainwash, which I just started, right? I mean, there's a lot of
You just started your Brainwash. Good.
He's in the rinse cycle.
I love it. So congratulations on Brainwash. And obviously I noticed that you wrote that book with your son.
I did. And I don't know if you met him, but because he was there at the GOL last time in Palm Beach. But anyway, yeah, I mean, it was great. It was really a wonderful experience. Maybe we'll talk about that today on the program. Are we on the program?
We are on the program now. I mean, listen, we want to talk today. I mean, that's what we want to talk about. We want to talk about your book, because I remember Grain Brain. God, I probably read that. And when did that book come out? 6, 7, 8 years ago, something like that? I mean,
about
longer.
7 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah. And I remember what a positive effect that had on me there. And now to see that, but I was, as a parent, and Derek as a parent, was the thing we were talking about before we admitted you on the call, was that like, Austin Perlmutter, like that must've been pretty cool to be able to write a book with your son.
It was a wonderful experience. I mean, obviously any parent would know that anytime they can experience anything with their children, it's great. But then, what happens is the kids grow up and they leave, and it pulls on your heartstrings. So, to have this opportunity with Austin, who then had already completed his internal medicine training, and actually the genesis of that book took place with Austin and me in this very room. We were talking about what it's like to be a doctor. What are the biggest challenges? And being a healthcare provider, you're really focused on outcome, on winning the battle, right? Whatever it is you're trying to accomplish. And interestingly, we stumbled upon, that there are 3 real important levers to pull in terms of bringing about an improvement in an individual. Number 1, we do our very best to learn as much as we can about a particular subject, right? That's what medical school is about. Conferences and journals is why we stay current, on and on. Number 2 is then we as healthcare practitioners do our best to transmit that information to the patient, right? We know a lot of stuff. We're sitting in the room with Mr. Jones. We're telling Mr. Jones, look, you really ought to cut back on your refined carbohydrates, whatever it may be, maybe get some exercise. And then the important part that we felt had been neglected for so long, remains neglected, is the fact that we depend upon, for the whole thing to work, depend upon the individual making the decision and doing what you've recommended, what you learned about, what you transmitted. Now,
right. Step 3,
do they do it? And it turns out that's the biggest breakdown in the system. That's where about 80% of the system fails, is because our patients don't follow through. And what do? We write in our notes that this patient is non-compliant. It's a great term because it applies all the blame to the patient because he or she didn't do, quote, what they were told. Now think about that. That's a bit rude, isn't it? I mean, you didn't have the outcome you were looking for as a doctor. So you point the finger, you hit the ball over the net to the patient's side of the net, and they are now labeled as non-compliant. Every time you see that patient, remember, that guy is non-compliant. Why am I wasting my time? He's not going to do what I tell him anyway. And furthermore, that guy gets home and looks at himself in the mirror or herself in the mirror and says, I just can't make good decisions. I can't do these things that I know are important. And that happens whether they've seen you as a doctor or not, because people are pretty darn well informed these days. They know pretty much what they should and shouldn't eat. Everybody knows they should get exercise, should get 8 hours of sleep, should maybe reduce their stress and maybe get out in nature. Not everybody knows all those things, but they know the big players. And even without going to a doctor, they are looking in the mirror saying, why in the heck can I do these things? Maybe tomorrow. And it never happens. So we decided to write a book about that moment that the patient or any individual, whether they're involved in a doctor-patient relationship or not, that very moment where they either make the decision to be impulsive and do what the heck they want right now, or they make a decision that they know is better for them and that will have a long-term positive outcome, not only for them, but for others. So what we discovered then is that this is really important and that there are really two unique parts of the brain that are involved in our decision-making. Either we make impulsive decisions, I want to eat that glazed donut right now and chase it down with a Diet Coke, and then watch TV for a couple hours and call it a day, or I'm going to involve myself in time-restricted eating and not have breakfast till 2 p.m., or I'll eat a nice breakfast, which is X, Y, or Z, because it's good for me. And, that is a decision based upon understanding. It's based upon knowing the facts and implementing them really based upon what good science is telling you, as opposed to being impulsive. I want this right now, the future be damned. So that is a part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex that allows us to take a step back, say, hey, what's the better decision here for me? But also, what's the better decision here for future me? And what's the better decision that might affect me and other people around me, my family, my community, the planet? So that's where we are. Do you default back to the primitive amygdala-based, I want it now, or you take a deep breath, and are you able then to make a better decision? Now, in the doctor-patient relationship, that is profound, because we understand that we have the tools that can help rewire the brain so that people are more likely to make better decisions. So we've given in that book that, Don, you're about to read, the tools that allow you to tap into this prefrontal cortex and make better decisions. It turns out that the more you make better decisions, the more you will make better decisions. That good decision-making begets better decision-making as we move along. Unfortunately, the corollary of that is that poor decisions foster poor decisions. In other words, not getting enough restorative sleep because you're staying up too late means you're going to eat crap the next day and ultimately stay up too late, which is a feed-forward cycle. We've all been there. We've all done that. We know it's true. I mean, that's what the science says. So that's the real centerpiece of Brainwash and what washing your brain and kind of pushing the reset button is all about.
Interesting. Derek?
Yeah, Doc, just listening to you talk, it made me think about just kind of real world things that I'm dealing with. And one is my kids like to be on their phones and on the internet and social media and iPads. And so my wife and I are trying to figure out, okay, how do we create compliance without punishing them or turning off the Wi-Fi or and knowing what the consequences of them being addicted to this is. What thoughts do you have about, helping parents with those types of things without being too overly restrictive and making the kids make good decisions around that stuff?
Well, first, I would be very careful to use the term addicted to. I mean, people kind of throw it around. Well, I'm really addicted to watching Game of Thrones, whatever. And but to be sure, about 6% of the world that has access to the internet, that's the number that is thrown around about in terms of people who are actually addicted, suffer their use of the internet to the extent that it interrupts with their health. It interrupts their lifestyle in such that it threatens their health, interrupts their ability to carry out meaningful relationships and even items of self-care. So That's a big number. That's 5 times the population of Great Britain. That really qualifies as being addicted to the use of the internet. Now, as a parent, these days, we didn't really go through that as much because our kids grew up at a time that the internet was taking hold. Now they're in their 30s, so we're not really as influential as we could be when they're 8 or 9. Having said that, however, I think that it's important for parents, and also conveying that information to children, that when you're doing one thing, you're not doing something else. When you're spending too much time on the internet, you're not engaged in other things, interacting with people socially, physically, involved in things, exercising out of doors and nature contact, etc. And if we prioritize some of those things as being really important during the course of your day, then we have to begin the idea of triaging our daily activities such that we do allow time for those things that are very important. 40% of our waking hours are spent in front of one screen or another, whether it's your computer screen, your pad, or your smartphone, 40% of your day. That doesn't leave a whole lot of time for other things. So if we think about prioritizing, that's really important. And the next thing I would say is that the internet is an amazing resource. And as it relates to children, an incredible resource as it relates to their education, as it relates to their ability these days to remain socially interactive with their friends, when the proscriptions are to remain socially distant, which I think is an extremely unfortunate term. Physically distant, perhaps, but socially distancing, I think, is just an inappropriate use of the term social. But having said that, we talk about in the book, for anyone, children or adult, applying what we call the test of time to your online experience. The T stands for time. How much time are you going to dedicate in this endeavor to interacting with people on Facebook, on Instagram, whatever it may be? Okay, I'm going to do it for 30 minutes. Set it aside. Do you remain intentional when you're involved in this task? Are you focused on looking up something about a country and writing a report, whatever it may be, that you're buying something, you're comparing refrigerators on Amazon, whatever it is? How much time did you allot? And now, are you intentional? Are you staying focused on what it is you're attempting to accomplish? If you're trying to reconnect with high school friends, great. But what we're getting at here is not to be at the mercy of the pop-ups, not to be at the mercy of how the next video is queued just based upon your well-described preferences that these algorithms are absolutely able to utilize to determine what's next for you, because you're going to be interested in something. And embedded in that experience are, of course, advertisements. M in our test of time. T, I, now we're at M. Are you mindful? Are you engaged in what you are doing? Or are you, while you're involved in this internet experience, thinking about other things, doing other things, talking on the phone? Remain mindful of the task and dedicated to the task. And finally, E actually takes place after the experience, and it deals with enriching. Was that last 2 hours I spent, am I net positive now, having done what I just did for the last 2 hours? Or did I really waste my time? And your time is really valuable. It's why we call it the test of time. So you apply this acronym to your online experience, and it allows you, after it's said and done, to really make an assessment as to the value of your choices in terms of what you're doing online. Again, the internet is an incredible way of democratizing knowledge globally. And in that regard, it's just breathtaking. We write books just based upon what we're able, the research we're able to do on the internet. But as we all know, our attention is sold to the highest bidder. And as such, where our eyeballs go on the internet has great value to others, who then manipulate that attention for their benefit and not for our benefit. So we have to be very, very mindful of that.
I have a question. We're just getting through that whole New Year's resolution craze, and you hear it every year. Someone's going to take a deep dive into doing something that they've been very unsuccessful with, probably their entire life, right? It's this fresh start. It's this new beginning. Now, when you originally started talking about brainwash, you were making it seem like it's 100% mental. I mean, do you believe it's 100% mental, or do you think there is somewhat of a detoxifying process that the body's going through if you're used to having a lot of sugar a couple of days into maybe eating the way that you wish you can eat all the time? People will tend to start craving things and they'll have that moment of weakness. I have found that when you kind of get through that barrier, it almost becomes a bit easier, yet a lot of people can't get up to that point. What's your opinion on that? Do you think it's 100% mental, or there is some type of this detoxification, sugar is a drug type of, approach where we have to get that out of our body, and that's obviously going to, trigger things differently mentally?
I am going to tell you, and it may not be the answer that you want, but it is
Every
what I
answer
feel
is what I
the
want
right
to
answer,
hear.
that it is absolutely both. Meaning that there is a physical substrate in the brain that determines which way we're going to go on any decision. There are many, many factors that the brain goes through, many areas of the brain that are brought on board for decision making. But what's really germane here is, are these decisions impulsive, primitive brain, fear, famine, reproduction? We'll leave it at that. The main drivers, our main reptilian brain kind of drivers moment to moment, are we making decisions based upon that, or are we able to bring into the decision-making process the adult in the room? Are we able to exercise control over our impulsivity and make better decisions? And it turns out, to answer your question, that there's a huge interplay between things like exercise, diet, sleep, meditation, stress, nature exposure, those events in our lives, and the decision-making process. And I'll explain how that works. The prefrontal cortex, the adult in the room, exercises what has been called, we didn't coin the term, top-down control over these primitive areas, reins it in, if you will. It's the reason that we don't let 5-year-olds vote or drive cars, because they're just acting impulsively. And hopefully by our teenage years, we begin to have the adult coming into the room making better decisions for the longer term. But that connection between the prefrontal cortex and the impulsivity center that allows the prefrontal cortex to keep things going where they should, as opposed to being impulsive day in and day out, that connection is threatened by things like inflammation. So when we recognize this mechanism of inflammation being central to things like heart disease and Alzheimer's and type 2 diabetes and obesity, it's the same inflammation that threatens the connectivity between the prefrontal cortex being able to rein in the impulsivity center. So that is very much answering your question. Any of our lifestyle choices that are involved in increasing inflammation, like eating highly processed foods, like staying up too late at night, like not exercising, for example. We know these things all amp inflammation. Gaining weight amplifies inflammation. This tends to keep the adult out of the room and tends to lock us into more impulsive thinking. Now, to get to your comment, which I think is extremely valuable, that followed your question, how can we then leverage the understanding of these influences so that we can finally gain control? That's what it's all about. So, for example, I'm meeting with a patient in the office who has type 2 diabetes, who clearly needs to stop eating refined carbohydrates and eat more healthful fat. That's my goal, but I can't get directly to that goal. We have to do a bit of an end around, meaning I'm going to talk till I'm blue in the face. I'm going to have the patient meet with our dietitian, going to give him printouts of the very best diets, everybody's books that we have. There's so many books written that are so helpful. It isn't going to work. And I'm not the first doctor he or she has seen. And I know darn well it's not going to work. And he or she knows it's not going to work. That's not the approach, because they don't have in place yet the decision-making apparatus to make the right decision, to stick to that diet. We got to work on that. That's job one. Diet isn't going to be the way we get there first, obviously. So what do? We work on sleep. I think it's the biggest player we can leverage to get people to a better place of decision making, because we know that about 46% of Americans are not getting enough restorative sleep on a weekly basis, and report that not having enough restorative sleep is actually interfering with their productivity during their day-to-day lives. That's a big number. What does good restorative sleep means? It means enough sleep, but it means enough quality sleep. It means getting enough deep sleep, enough REM sleep, getting to sleep quicker, going to sleep on time, and total length of sleep needs to be adequate, let's say 8 hours. How do we know that? Well, we could send them to a sleep laboratory. I've been. It's no fun, and it's very weird, and you're not going to sleep well in a sleep laboratory, knowing full well that there are cameras watching you. You have a heart monitor, pulse oximeter. It's probably about the worst place you're ever going to go to try to get a good night's sleep. Fortunately, these days, we can tell people to buy a wearable device. They can buy an Oura Ring or other device, and the very next day, they can just upload to their smartphone and know exactly how much deep sleep, REM sleep, light sleep, how long was their sleep latency, how long did it take them to get into sleep, how many times did they wake up in the middle of the night and might not have even remembered it. So that's valuable information, because you can change things and see how it affects tomorrow night's sleep, like how late you had dinner. When did you have your last cup of coffee in the day? Did you watch, were you on your computer screen at night getting blue light exposure, which diminished your pineal gland's ability to make melatonin, all these things. My point is that getting a good night's sleep can be a powerful on-ramp that then allows this individual patient then the ability to connect to the prefrontal cortex and make those dietary changes that you have then recommended. It might be exercise. It might be getting out in nature. Getting out in nature is exceedingly powerful. Most of that research is done in Japan, but what a powerful tool to have in your toolbox that can then open the door to bring other tools on board that may not have been necessarily available to that individual patient prior to working on their decision-making process.
Yeah, I really like this this line here, Doc. Just because I know with my own sleep, it's been a bit of a canary in the coal mine for me, where, man, I don't fall asleep. There's stuff going on in my head, and then I started to go through that checklist, and maybe you can help me with this too, because yeah, I look at diet, caffeine, and all that, and then I started to look at things like obviously light exposure, the type of exercise, stretching before, meditation, and I've had to piece together a formula that works for me, and I'm turning 52 this year, so I'm trying to figure out, okay, does aging affect it as well? And so, do you counsel people a lot on all of these things?
Yeah, and aging does affect it. And it brings up a interesting conversation. What does that mean? And I think in the context of COVID, I knew we'd get there sooner or later. It's interesting because there's a lot of talk these days, rightfully so, about higher risk for bad outcome depending on how old you are, right? The older you are, the higher is your risk for bad outcome and death. And I think that's fair to say, because that's where the data has been generated. But let's be clear, ultimately, we shouldn't be talking about chronological age. We should be talking about biological age. In other words, there are plenty of people who are 70 whose chronological age is 70. They've had 70 birthdays, but their biological age might be 58 because they have taken good care of themselves. There are plenty of people who are 58 chronologically, but yet are biologically aged 70 or 80. The point is that physics doesn't allow us to literally turn the clock back. We are our age. There are the certain number of rings on the tree. You can't really get away from that. But you sure as heck can affect your biological age. Absolutely. And you do so based on, maybe we could have another conversation about that, but there are plenty of things we can do that have a huge impact on how we age biologically. Importantly, how our immune system ages, how our immune cells become senescent. And really the aging or the senescence of our immune cells has a much wider implication for our general health than simply our ability to respond appropriately to a virus in the case of COVID. So much work is being done in terms of how we can keep our immune systems more youthful, how we can allow our bodies to rid themselves of cells which have become senescent. This is called senolytic therapy. We could perhaps talk about what that means, how to do that. But having said that, we do with, let's say, our biological age, begin to sleep less and less and experience less and less restoration of our bodies as we biologically, certainly chronologically as well. I'm just saying the biggest parameter here is biological aging. So the more that we can engage in lifestyle choices to slow our biological aging, the better will be our sleep, which also helps us with our biological aging. So, this is another feed forward process. Unfortunately, as people age more quickly biologically by eating inappropriately, not engaging in good lifestyle choices, their sleep deteriorates. Sleep is really quite compromised in individuals as they become overweight and ultimately become obese, as they develop insulin resistance and ultimately develop type 2 diabetes. These are powerful negative influencers on quality and quantity of sleep, which then does what? It compromises immune function and it increases inflammation, which plays a central role in how these various diseases get worse over time. So, again, getting back to Brainwash, that's what it's all about. It's about interrupting. First, it's about recognizing that this is happening, and then bringing techniques on board to interrupt this process and reverse them.
It is amazing because, everyone, we've been talking about this for a long time, how the brain can affect our actions and getting ourselves mentally in the right state of mind. I thought it's fascinating, though, how you started discussing biological age, and maybe you have the answer to this already, but if there was a way to assign a biological age, does that start rewiring someone a little bit differently? My parents are 75 years old, and they're, love them more than life. But they're like, we're getting older, how many more years now? If they were told, they're in good shape, but if they were told, listen, your biological age is really 62, does that wire them differently now? Does that give them a level of this positive outlook on their, well, yeah, you know what? Maybe I got another 30, 40 years ahead of me, and does that start rewiring them a little bit differently to where they can be successful coming in their later years?
Well, no doubt, but I think it, one would say if your chronological age is 60, your biological age is 50, you would say, gee whiz, I'm doing something right. But that's all predicated on how you've been able to assess your biological age. Your chronological age, obviously, but what is used to assess your biological age? And right. I think that's an incredibly difficult question to answer. I was on the original review committee for the Longevity X Prize, meeting with other scientists around the world to determine if we're going to give an X Prize for something related to longevity, how do we assess the process by which we are extending life? In other words, how do we assess aging? And it really gets down to what is aging and what is causing aging. Is it mitochondrial dysfunction? Is it double-stranded DNA breakage? Is it accumulation of senescent cells? I mean, how do we assess it? And I think that's been the big challenge. Is it telomere length? And I think most researchers now would indicate while that is interesting, it's not really a very accurate marker of aging per se. Now, I would say, if challenged, that in my opinion, probably the most valid marker of aging is something called the Horvath methylation clock. And basically, it's an assessment of the pattern of methylation or changes that have taken place in, sorry about this, in our epigenome, the way that our DNA is expressing itself moment to moment. The controllers over our DNA expression can be mapped. And it's the pattern of the mapping of how our DNA is controlled that to date seems to be the best marker of aging. Having said that, as technical as that sounds, there are companies now offering you the ability to have that type of test. And that might well be the most accurate measure of your biological age. So if you were able to have Horvath methylation epigenome testing done, and it came out 5 years younger, that's definitely a pat on the back telling you you're doing something right.
And what's the downside, right? I mean, what would be
downside would be A, is it valid? I think it is. B, there are some challenges to it. We know that there's something called the Latin paradox, for example, whereby Latin individuals seem to have better longevity, even in the face of some of challenges that others experience. Cardiovascular markers, inflammation markers, obesity, et cetera, seem to have longevity that isn't necessarily in sync with those things. But I think the only real downside would be for you, or any individual, is if suddenly your Horvath clock comes back and says, you know, you're a lot older than you think you are. Probably people are going to recognize that anyway and be, you know, prepared for it. But could that be positive? Yeah, it really depends on how you contextualize it. So if I suddenly got back my Horvath clock, I have not done it yet, that said that I test out 5 years older than I am, then I would double down on what I think are the right things that I'm doing currently. And I would also challenge what I'm doing, wondering if, in fact, these are the right choices that I'm making. I would further increase my assessment, self-assessment of things like my continuous glucose monitoring, markers of inflammation, body weight, body mass index, et cetera. You know, I look at my sleep almost every night using an Oura ring. I would pay closer attention to that, you know, probably even more exercise, maybe less exercise, don't know. But I'd be looking at my day-to-day metrics as available to me through continuous glucose monitoring, through the Oura ring, et cetera. I would look at those in closer scrutiny based upon making more changes in my day-to-day activities and seeing how it reflects in those measurable parameters.
What are you talk markers of inflammation? What are some things people can go and, you know, obviously get blood testing and talk to their doctor about? What are some of the things they're looking for? And then what is the process by which you try to manage those inflammation markers?
It's a very good question. And I would say that, you know, you can home test for inflammation now. You can actually go to the store and buy a very sophisticated test to determine your level of inflammation. It's called a tape measure. So by putting a tape measure around your belly, you know how inflamed you are. So, you know, what I'm getting at is that the size of your belly absolutely correlates with markers of inflammation. Now, could you have those markers of inflammation tested? Yes. And they include things like a fasting blood sugar. Who knew? Something else you can do at home without having to go to the doctor's office. Fasting blood sugar directly correlates with more established markers of inflammation like C-reactive protein, tumor necrosis factor alpha, interleukin-1 beta, interleukin-6, more sophisticated blood markers of inflammation. But that said, you know what? Your blood sugar is telling you that your body is inflamed or not. Even better, continuous glucose monitor. I mean, you know, that's what I use. And then I look at the data that my CGM puts out. It goes through software on my smartphone called Levels Health. And that tells me not only what my trends are, what I've done over the previous week, month, however long, but also helps me understand the influence of my lifestyle choices and how they may impact my day-to-day blood sugar, not just fasting, but postprandial, after I've eaten, 2 hours after I've eaten, what happens you know, before I go to bed, et cetera. So it's a level of understanding that's great to know. It's kind of cool to know moment to moment, but beyond that, it's real empowerment. I would say that controlling your blood sugar is the #1 thing that you can do for health in general, brain health, heart health, immune health, that's for sure. It's the, you know, it's the biggest lever that you can pull.
I 100% agree with that, by the way, and you don't need me to tell you that. But I work with a lot of challengers, and I work with a lot of people who are coming to me for body transformation goals. And in the back of my head, they want to lose weight. In a way, you reminded me of when you were talking about sleep. That's the first marker that you really focus on. And besides sleep, I'm always telling them, no, we need to maintain blood sugar level, and you'll end up craving less garbage. And yet most people are envisioning having to restrict calories and always pull away, where in my opinion, 90% of the people that come to me are already in some sort of a deficit. Do you agree with that approach? Is that something that you're saying? Yes, a lot of the population, they're under fueled. They don't have enough nutrition in their body. They're not maintaining blood sugar, and they will find more success if they actually bump up those good calories, and they focus a little bit more on things like hydration and nutrition.
No, I don't agree. I mean, with all due respect, I mean, it might be
No.
people
That's
that
why I'm
you're
asking.
interacting with.
I want to hear
But I
it.
think by and large, people are overfed and undernourished. So it's not a question of not having caloric resources. That's the problem, is people have way too much in the way of caloric resources, too many calories, but not enough nutrition, not enough nutrients. So I think we're probably saying the same thing.
It's similar. It's what you're saying is they're eating too much of the wrong stuff. And
Yeah, it's not a question of not having enough fuel. I mean,
right.
they're
It's a
having
question of
way
having
too much fuel.
the right fuel is what you're saying.
Right. And, this is a classic example of evolutionary environmental mismatch, whereby, our bodies, based upon our heritage, our ancestors, our bodies really do everything they can to survive. And that means we have powerful mechanisms on board in all humans to store calories, because our ancestors never knew when food was not going to be available. So when we're exposed to carbohydrates, and specifically fructose, our bodies are getting a signal that winter is coming. We better make fat, and make it right now. We become insulin resistant. And that used to be, in our primate ancestors, it used to be a wonderful thing. Insulin resistance and inflammation, and locking up body fat, making more body fat, and reducing our fatty acid oxidation. That was a survival mechanism that is now counterproductive for us, because now we have an overabundance of calories, an overabundance of fructose. So that signaling pathway of fructose creating uric acid that tells our bodies to make fat is absolutely working against us, and is absolutely front and center as a causal mechanism for obesity, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, dyslipidemia, all of the components of metabolic syndrome, which used to be a survival mechanism. And now it's, basically the number one cause, plays a role in the number one causes of death on our planet right now.
Wow. I had some questions too about your thoughts on just technology. You mentioned the Aura Ring and some of the other monitoring stuff you do. And it seems like, the stuff that I'm looking at, it seems like Amazon wants to get in on healthcare, and Microsoft, and Bill Gates is an expert on pandemics, right? What are the pros and cons right now of technology that you use, and what are some of the pitfalls of maybe where technology is going with regards to healthcare and wellness?
Well, let's start with pitfalls. I think people can get overly involved. We have some that's become known as orthorexia, where people just freak out if they eat the wrong thing, and everything has to be done in such a way that you can have a good life and feel like you're appreciating life. So I think I have friends who I think are really just overly neurotic about the technology. So I think it can get away from you. I think that we have to understand that everyone's an individual, in this world now of personalized medicine. To give a one-size-fits-all understanding to these results, I think is a little bit challenging for people who may be on one side or the other of the spectrum of glucose, of ketones, or whatever it is that we're looking at. By and large, we know that there is a U-shaped curve or sweet spot with many of the things that we measure. The amount of sleep we get, exercise, blood glucose, uric acid level, sodium, whatever it may be. Too little is bad, too much is too bad. but the Goldilocks zone is where the bed feels just right. So, but that sweet spot, which is an unfortunate term for obvious reasons, is variable depending on a person's history, a person's genetics, inheritance, a person's, in other aspects of his or her environment, their microbiome, for example. All these things play in to determine, well, then what's the best glucose level for that person? So I think that's where some of the technology can be a little challenging, because by and large, the messaging that people are getting is that this is your best blood sugar across the board. And I think it's very important to add to that, this is the best level of blood sugar for you. And that is something that requires, I think, investigation and interaction with a professional to determine what would be best for you, based, for example, on your SNPs, on your genome, but also what makes you feel good. What blood sugar level do you feel pretty productive and energetic and can exercise and can do constructive things with your mind, etc. And that's going to vary person to person. Not everybody is fully able to get into, keto adapt. Some people do it much easier than others. And that is something you can train for. But, for some people, a blood sugar of 80 is, they're just out to, they just can't function. Whereas, I can go all day at a blood sugar of 60 and be perfectly fine because I've been doing it for an awful long time. Certainly somebody new to the game is going to notice a blood pressure blood sugar that's normally 98 to 100 going down to 82. That's going to be a big deal for the first week or two. So all of these things I think have to be considered if you're working with people, or if you're decided to go this alone, which I don't recommend in terms of making significant lifestyle changes, in terms of what is best for the individual. That said, I like to make the global recommendations, which they make. These are not specifics, unique specifics, but are for the grand scale, like cut back on eating gluten. Don't eat as much refined carbohydrates. Ultra processed foods, keep them off the table. Go more plant-based if you can. If you can buy organic, go for it. And those are kind of broad stroke recommendations that I think don't require specificity. But that said, when you're one-on-one with an individual and offering counsel, I think it's really important to consider who that person is and what his or her needs are.
Now, I've known you for, I guess it's 7 years now. And when I think when we interviewed you last, you mentioned that you're not on the ketogenic diet all the time, or are you, or did I get that wrong?
Oh, I'm not in ketosis all the time.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
My diet is really designed to be one that favors ketosis, but I cycle through deeper ketosis and I measure it. I use Precision X to look at beta hydroxybutyrate levels, but I cycle between low levels of ketones and much higher levels. And I actually think I feel better doing that. I think there's some precedent in terms of literature that would suggest that might be in a more appropriate course. But by and large, more importantly, I think, is reining in your blood sugar. And as such, the more you rein it in during a period of time, the more ketotic you will by default become. Because as your blood sugar gets lower and lower, then you begin to mobilize fat for beta oxidation.
Derek, did you have something?
No, all this information is splendid, and I'm obviously just assessing my own life right now and trying to figure out how I want to spend the next 10 years.
So can you, because you've been so gracious with your time, I know we're 45 minutes already. So Brainwash is the new book. I mean, you've written, it seems like behind you, dozens of books, but the ones, I mean, Grain Brain and Brain Maker, I mean, those are the ones that I knew of. This is just basically because I just started this book actually.
Okay.
And I'm getting the gist of the direction. Obviously, after speaking with you, I completely understand the direction it's going, but I'm actually even more excited to deep dive into it tonight. Can you give everyone some takeaways on what to expect out of this book and why they should be, going and making this their purchase tonight?
Well, I'd say that if I had to use a hashtag, I would say hashtag for why that's fantastic. WTF. Right? Isn't that what that stands for? Why that's fantastic.
That's fantastic.
And because I think we just didn't know a lot of this stuff. You know, the degree of our mental manipulation day in and day out in our interactions with the internet, for example, how pervasive and deep and manipulative that is. We called it out. Called it out so that once people can recognize it, they can realize that they're not in charge, and they're going to be able, they want to take charge again. They want to regain control. This book is about regaining control. It's about bringing the adult back into the room and regaining the ability to make better choices for yourself and for others as well. And, you know, one of the things that I think was very timely about Brainwash is when it came out, we were just at the very beginning of COVID, and we were just getting towards a election time. And it talks about a lot about how this area of the brain, this impulsivity area, the amygdala, is an area that when it is being utilized, does not allow us to engage something called empathy. Now, there are actually two types of empathy that we talk about in the book. One is emotional empathy, whereby if you stub your toe, I say, oh, ouch, gee, whiz, that must hurt. And the other is cognitive empathy, which is the ability that we have as humans, hopefully, to experience and participate in another person's point of view. Now, again, think about when this book came out and how the past year has been about polarization and not being able to hear the other side, hear what somebody else's point of view may be. That is called cognitive empathy. That requires that other part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, that can say, well, you know, I don't agree with you, but can you explain to me why you feel the way you do? And maybe I'll change my mind. We don't see an awful lot of that going on these days. And the problem with that is it's not good for you, it's not good for me, but it's not good for progress, because ultimately when we share ideas and we can be good listeners to the other person's point of view, we oftentimes come out with a novel solution to a problem that is better than would have come out from each individual. And that's what we seem to be losing these days. You know, people get elected to public office and often say, you know, when I get into the House or the Senate, I'm going to reach across the aisle and all that. And we don't see a lot of that. And I would submit that we need to get rid of the aisle. We need to get rid of cutting the Senate in half. And you got one group here that says this and this group that says the opposite. And there is no interaction. You know, why not? Because there's an
no
aisle
discussion
down the
anymore.
middle.
What you're saying
We
is there's
shuffle
no
the
discussion.
cards,
Yeah.
and you sit next to this person, and that's it. And ultimately, you end up talking to that person, of course, you know, with distancing appropriately. But that's what we need. We need to mix it all up and let people sit down and talk about stuff, as opposed to digging their feet in because that's what their political party wants them to do, and that'll help ensure their reelection.
Are there some things you can tell people now, like being a healthcare professional and an expert, as we've gone through almost a year of COVID now? Do we have some positive things to look forward to, in your opinion?
I think we have things on both sides of the ledger. I mean, certainly as we are having this discussion today, numbers are looking better in the three major parameters. New case diagnoses, hospitalizations, and death rates are coming down. They are coming down more quickly in some areas in comparison to others, with the concern being that there may be threats by new variants, if you will. You know, the idea that suddenly this virus is mutating is interesting, but, you know, it mutates 50 to 60 times a day. And, you know, the point is almost all these mutations have no real effect in terms of its how aggressive it is, both in terms of how quickly it spreads and the morbidity and mortality associated with the virus. But the point is it's always mutating because it's always trying to find a better way to do what it wants to do. It's hard to imagine a virus wants to do something, but that's reality. So are immunizations having an effect? Yes, they are. I think the Israeli experience has clearly proven the effectiveness of immunization in terms of driving down the three categories I've described. But I think that the degree of improvement we're seeing, at least in America, isn't likely significantly impacted by the number of immunizations that have happened. In other words, There is some attrition of the virus itself occurring somewhat naturally. But in addition, I think that our choices and awareness are helping as well. There is concern that there will be a resurgence. Certainly hoping that doesn't happen, but as James Cameron, the movie director, has said, hope is not a strategy. So we need to have strategies in place. We know that behavior, the choices that we make, have a huge impact in terms of what's going on with this virus. So again, we get back to decision making. Do we want decisions made because I want to do certain things? You be damned. In other words, is there empathy involved in my decision making for you? Am I using my prefrontal cortex, or am I locked into myself, narcissism, no empathy? I want this now. I refuse to do certain things, and I'm just going to live my life as I choose without considering how it might affect others. In a way, we could use a simile here, which would be cigarette smoking. If you want to smoke cigarettes, all fine, have at it. That's your choice for you. But you can't smoke cigarettes in public places and movie theaters and restaurants. Why? Because it then affects other people. And I would say, now committing to a position on this, which I tried to avoid, but I'm going to commit, mask wearing, for example. If you don't want to wear a mask, that's totally your choice, perfectly fine. But if you're in a situation whereby you might affect the health of another individual, then I think it's reasonable to think that that's when you should be wearing a mask. If you want to take the risk of not wearing a mask by being out and doing things, great, but not really appropriate to that your choice would endanger another person. That's part of the empathy story that we talk about in Brainwash.
That's fair. Dr. Perlmutter, you've been so gracious with your time. Can you let everyone know where they can find you on social media, or if they want to go look at your new book here, Brainwash?
Brainwashbook.com is the website for that. It's available everywhere. I am at drperlmutter.com, drperlmutter.com. Instagram, I think, is David Perlmutter MD. Facebook is David Perlmutter. No, Instagram is David Perlmutter, and Facebook is David Perlmutter MD. And I hope I got that all right.
No, you definitely did. And you know what? I know Grain Brain was one of the reads to this day that I recommend people to dive into. So I'm even more excited to jump into this tonight. But thank you so much for your time. You've always been so gracious.
Thank you so much for having me.
So well spoken. You really are. You just do such a great way in kind of making it very relatable for people to understand. So Derek and I really appreciate that.
My pleasure. Great seeing you both again.
Thanks, bud.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Take care.